I was standing on my deck watching the sunrise over Lake Sinclair when I noticed the construction crew setting up equipment on my waterfront property, and that's when I knew something had gone terribly wrong. My name is James Eastwood, and I'd owned this beautiful piece of lakefront property in Eatonton, Georgia for 15 years. The house sat on 3 acres with nearly 200 feet of pristine waterfront, and it was my sanctuary away from my marketing job in Atlanta. I'd drive up here every weekend, sometimes taking the whole week off just to fish and watch the water. The property had been in rough shape when I bought it, but I'd spent years fixing it up, building the deck, clearing the overgrowth, and turning it into something special. That morning in early April, I grabbed my coffee and walked down toward the water where a group of men in hard hats were unloading surveying equipment from a truck. My heart started pounding, because I sure as hell hadn't authorized any construction on my land. "Hey, what's going on here?" I called out as I approached. A man in his 50s with a clipboard turned to face me. "We're starting the site prep for the new development. You have business here?" "Business? I own this land, every inch of it." He frowned and looked down at his paperwork. "According to our permits, this parcel was rezoned for multifamily residential development. We're with Caldwell Construction. We purchased the building rights from the property owner." My stomach dropped. "I'm the property owner, James Eastwood, and I never sold any building rights to anyone." The foreman's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. We've got all the proper documentation from the HOA. They handled everything." "What HOA? I'm not part of any HOA." He shuffled through his papers and pulled out a document. "Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. It says right here they have authority over all properties in the development area." I felt my face getting hot. "There's no development. This is private property, my property. I want you off my land right now." The foreman held up his hands. Okay. Let me make some calls. We don't want any problems." I stood there watching them while the foreman stepped away to talk on his phone. 20 minutes later, they started packing up their equipment. The foreman came back over and handed me a business card. "My boss wants you to contact the HOA office. Here's their information. We're going to halt work until this gets sorted out, but I gotta tell you, we've already put down $300,000 on this project." After they left, I went back inside and immediately started digging through my files. I pulled out the deed to the property, every document from when I purchased it, tax records, everything. Nowhere in any of my paperwork was there any mention of a homeowners association. I'd specifically chosen this property because it was independent, no HOA restrictions, no community rules. Just me and the lake. I called the number on the business card. A cheerful voice answered after 2 rings. "Lakeside Estates HOA, this is Patricia speaking." "Yes, hi. My name is James Eastwood. I own property at 4782 Lakeshore Drive, and there was a construction crew on my land this morning claiming they bought building rights from you." "Oh, Mr. Eastwood, we've been trying to reach you for months. You haven't been responding to any of our notices." "What notices? I never received anything from you." "Well, we sent multiple letters to the property address. The rezoning was approved last October, and the building rights were sold in January. This has all been properly documented." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Madam, I don't know what you think is happening, but I own this property outright. I'm not part of your HOA, I never signed any HOA agreement, and you had no authority to rezone my land or sell anything." There was a pause. "Sir, all properties within the Lakeside Estates boundaries fall under our jurisdiction. This was established in 2009. I bought my property in 2011, and there was no HOA. Trust me, that was one of the main reasons I bought here. Perhaps you should come into our office to discuss this with our president. She handles all legal matters." "Fine. Where's your office?" She gave me an address in Milledgeville, about 20 minutes away. I told her I'd be there within the hour. I changed into proper clothes, grabbed all my property documents, and made the drive into town. The HOA office was located in a small strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. When I walked in, the receptionist, presumably Patricia, looked up from her computer with a practiced smile. "Mr. Eastwood." "That's me." "Let me get Rebecca for you. She's our HOA president." A few minutes later, a woman in her late 40s emerged from a back office. She had the kind of haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and wore a blazer that looked 2 sizes too small. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm Rebecca Kensington. Please come back to my office." I followed her into a cramped room with file cabinets lining the walls and a desk covered in papers. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "So, Patricia tells me you're confused about the rezoning of your property." "I'm not confused. I'm telling you that you don't have authority over my property." Rebecca pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Eastwood, when the county established the Lakeside Estates Development Zone in 2009, all properties within the designated boundaries automatically fell under HOA governance. Your property is within those boundaries. Show me where I signed anything agreeing to that." "It's not about individual agreements. It's a county ordinance." "Then show me the ordinance." She pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. I read through it carefully. It described the creation of a planned development area around Lake Sinclair, but it specifically stated that existing properties would be grandfathered in unless the owners voluntarily joined the HOA. "This says grandfathered properties are exempt." Rebecca's smile tightened. "That provision only applied to properties developed before 2005. Your land was undeveloped when the ordinance passed." "But I owned it. The land was mine. That makes it an existing property." "The legal interpretation is that undeveloped land falls under the new zoning requirements." I sat back in my chair, studying her. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. "Okay, let's say for argument's sake that you're right. You can't just sell building rights to someone else's property. I hold the deed. The HOA has the authority to manage development within our jurisdiction. The building rights are separate from property ownership. We sold the air rights and development permits. The construction company will build multifamily units, and you'll maintain ownership of the underlying land while receiving lease payments." "I never agreed to any of that." "You were notified multiple times, Mr. Eastwood. Failure to respond is considered tacit approval under our bylaws." My hands were shaking with anger. "Your bylaws don't apply to me because I'm not a member of your HOA. I want documentation showing exactly when I supposedly joined this association." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Mr. Eastwood, you can fight this if you want, but we have legal authority here. We've already sold the rights. The contracts are signed and construction is scheduled to begin. If you interfere, we'll be forced to take legal action against you." "You do that, because I'll be talking to a lawyer today." I stood up and walked out of her office, barely controlling my temper. The whole drive back to my property, I was on the phone. First, I called my friend Marcus, who was a real estate attorney in Atlanta. I explained the situation, and he immediately told me to send him all my documents and not to let anyone back on my property. "James, this sounds like a land grab," he said. "HOAs have been getting more aggressive, but they can't just claim jurisdiction over property where the owner never consented. Send me everything you have, and I'll start digging into this." The next call was to the Putnam County Courthouse. I spoke with someone in the zoning department and asked for copies of all documents related to the Lakeside Estates HOA and any rezoning applications for my property. They said they'd pull the records and I could pick them up the next day. When I got back to the house, I spent the rest of the afternoon photographing my property boundaries, checking my survey markers, and reviewing every piece of mail I'd received over the past year. I found nothing from the HOA, not a single letter, notice, or communication of any kind. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse and picked up the zoning records. Sitting in my truck in the parking lot, I went through every page. What I found made my blood boil. There was a rezoning application for my property submitted last October, but the signature on the application wasn't mine. Someone had forged my signature. The application claimed I was requesting to rezone from residential single-family to multifamily development. Attached to it was a document purporting to be my membership agreement with the Lakeside Estates HOA, also with a forged signature. I took photos of everything with my phone and immediately sent them to Marcus. He called me back within an hour. "James, this is fraud. Clear-cut fraud. Someone forged your signature on multiple legal documents. You need to file a police report immediately." I drove straight to the Eatonton Police Department and asked to speak with someone about filing a report. A detective named Wilson took my statement and examined the documents I'd brought. He was a solid guy in his early 40s with a no-nonsense attitude. "Mr. Eastwood, this is definitely something we need to investigate. Forgery, fraud, possibly conspiracy. Do you know who might have done this? The only people who benefit are the HOA and whoever bought the building rights. The HOA president is a woman named Rebecca Kensington." He wrote down the name. "We'll start there. I'll need to keep copies of these documents. Whatever you need, I want charges filed against whoever did this." Over the next week, things escalated quickly. Marcus filed an emergency injunction to stop any construction on my property and filed suit against the HOA, Rebecca Kensington personally, and Caldwell Construction for fraud, trespassing, and attempted theft of property rights. The court granted the temporary injunction, which meant no construction could proceed until the case was resolved. Detective Wilson called me 3 days after I filed the report. "Mr. Eastwood, we've been investigating, and we found something interesting. The rezoning application was filed by Rebecca Kensington herself. She claimed she had your power of attorney." "I never gave her power of attorney. I'd never even heard of her before last week." "That's what we figured. We also discovered she's done this before. 2 other properties in the area had similar issues, but those owners settled with the HOA rather than fight it. We're building a case for multiple counts of forgery and fraud." "What about the construction company? Did they know?" "That's murkier. They claim they did their due diligence and everything appeared legitimate. They might be victims here too, but we're still investigating." The following Monday, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Mr. Eastwood, this is David Caldwell from Caldwell Construction. I think we need to talk." "I'm listening." "I just found out about the forged documents. My company paid $300,000 for those building rights in good faith. We were told everything was legitimate. I'm as angry about this as you are." "So what do you want from me?" "I want to know if there's a way we can work this out. Is there any scenario where you'd actually be willing to sell development rights? Because if not, I need to know now so I can focus on getting my money back from the HOA." I thought about it. "Mr. Caldwell, I bought this property specifically because it was private and undeveloped. I have zero interest in having apartment buildings or condos on my land. This is my personal retreat." He sighed. "I figured, but I had to ask. Then I guess we're both going after the HOA. Looks like it. One more thing. My lawyer pulled some records. The Lakeside Estates HOA has been operating in the red for 2 years. They're broke. That's probably why they tried to pull this scam, to generate income from selling development rights they didn't actually own." That was an interesting piece of information. "Do you think they can pay you back?" "Doubtful, but Rebecca Kensington owns a pretty nice house in Milledgeville. If we can prove she personally committed fraud, I can go after her assets." After we hung up, I called Marcus and filled him in. He said it supported our case and made it more likely we'd win quickly. 2 weeks later, Detective Wilson called again. "We're making arrests tomorrow morning. Wanted to give you a heads up." "Arrests? Plural." "Rebecca Kensington and 2 board members, Paul Hutchins and Sandra Meyer. They all signed off on the forged documents and participated in the scheme. We've got them on multiple counts of forgery, fraud, and theft by deception." "What about the money they got from Caldwell Construction?" "That's part of it. They deposited it into the HOA account and then transferred significant amounts to their personal accounts as management fees. This wasn't just negligence. It was an organized scheme to defraud." The next morning, I watched the local news and saw Rebecca Kensington being led out of her house in handcuffs. The reporter said she and 2 other HOA board members had been arrested for fraud related to illegal property sales. My name wasn't mentioned, thankfully, but they said multiple victims had been identified. My phone rang constantly that day. Other property owners in the area had heard about the arrests and wanted to know if they'd been victims too. I directed them all to Detective Wilson. The criminal case moved forward while my civil case proceeded separately. Marcus was confident we'd win the civil suit, especially now that criminal charges had been filed. The question was whether I'd ever recover any legal fees or damages. In early May, I got a call from a lawyer representing the HOA's insurance company. They wanted to settle. "Mr. Eastwood, my client is prepared to offer you $200,000 to settle all claims and drop the lawsuit." I laughed. Your client tried to steal my property. $200,000 doesn't even cover my legal fees and the stress this has caused. What would you consider fair? I thought about it. Complete dismissal of all claims against my property, written confirmation that I have never been and will never be subject to HOA authority, $500,000 in damages, and full coverage of my legal fees. That's quite steep. Your insured committed fraud. Be glad I'm not asking for more. He said he'd get back to me. Marcus told me later that the insurance company was desperate to settle because if the criminal case resulted in convictions, their exposure would be much worse. 3 days later, they agreed to my terms with one modification. They'd pay $400,000 in damages plus legal fees, and they'd also fund a corrected survey of the entire Lakeside Estates area to properly identify which properties were actually subject to HOA authority and which weren't. Marcus advised me to take it. The settlement was finalized in June. I received a check for $475,000, which included the $400,000 in damages and $75,000 in legal fees. More importantly, I received a recorded document from the county stating definitively that my property at 4782 Lakeshore Drive was not subject to any HOA restrictions or authority. The criminal case took longer. Rebecca Kensington, Paul Hutchins, and Sandra Meyer all initially pled not guilty, but as more evidence came out, 2 of them changed their pleas. Paul Hutchins and Sandra Meyer agreed to testify against Rebecca in exchange for reduced sentences. They each got 2 years of probation and had to pay restitution. Rebecca went to trial in September. I had to testify, explaining how I'd discovered the construction crew on my property and how I'd never signed any documents or agreed to any HOA membership. The prosecution presented the forged documents alongside my real signature on other legal papers. The differences were obvious even to me. They also brought in a handwriting expert who testified that the signatures were clearly forgeries. The prosecution showed that Rebecca had signed my name on at least 7 different documents over an 8-month period, each one furthering the scheme to take control of my property and sell the development rights. David Caldwell testified about paying $300,000 for rights that didn't exist. 2 other property owners testified about similar schemes Rebecca had tried with their land, though those cases hadn't gone as far. The most damning evidence came from the HOA's financial records. After Rebecca and her co-conspirators sold the building rights to Caldwell Construction, they'd transferred $90,000 out of the HOA account into their personal accounts, split 3 ways. They'd labeled the transfers as management bonuses, but there was no documentation supporting any such bonuses, and the HOA bylaws didn't provide for them. Rebecca's lawyer tried to argue that she genuinely believed she had authority over my property, and that any signature irregularities were administrative errors, not intentional forgery. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of testimony and 4 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty on all counts, multiple counts of forgery, fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. She also had to pay full restitution to Caldwell Construction and to me, though everyone knew she didn't have that kind of money. Her house was already in foreclosure. After the sentencing, David Caldwell approached me outside the courthouse. "Thank you for fighting this. If you'd just settled quietly, she would have kept doing it to other people." I couldn't let her get away with it. Nobody should be able to just steal someone's property because they have some fake authority. He shook my hand. "If you ever change your mind about development, call me. I'll do it right." I smiled. "I won't, but I appreciate the offer." The story made regional news. Several articles covered the case as an example of HOA overreach and fraud. I gave one interview to a local paper explaining what had happened and encouraging other property owners to carefully review any HOA claims over their land. That winter, I received a letter from the county. They were conducting a full audit of all HOA boundaries in the Putnam County area following the scandal. They'd identified 15 properties that had been incorrectly classified as subject to HOA authority, including 3 that had paid dues for years despite never actually joining. Those owners were getting refunds. The Lakeside Estates HOA itself dissolved in November. Without Rebecca and the other board members, and with their reputation destroyed, they couldn't attract new members or maintain operations. The few properties that had legitimately been part of the development were released from their HOA obligations. I spent Christmas at my lake house, sitting on my deck and watching the water just like I always had. The whole ordeal had taken 9 months from start to finish, but it was over. My property was secure, my rights were protected, and the people who'd tried to steal from me were facing consequences. Marcus came up for New Year's with his wife and kids. We grilled steaks and set off fireworks over the water at midnight. His youngest daughter, Emma, asked me why my house was so far from other houses. "Because I like the peace and quiet," I told her, "and I don't like people telling me what I can do with my own land." Marcus laughed. "That's the truth." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat out on the deck alone with a bourbon. I thought about how close I'd come to losing this place without even knowing it was at risk. If that construction crew had shown up a week later, after more paperwork had been filed, after more rights had been transferred, it might have been much harder to fight. The whole experience had taught me to be vigilant about property records and to never assume that just because I owned something, it was safe from people who wanted to take it. Rebecca Kensington had counted on property owners being confused, intimidated, or too tired to fight. She'd counted on people not understanding their rights or not having the resources to defend them. I'd been lucky in some ways. I had the money to hire a good lawyer. I had the time to fight the case. I had clear documentation showing I'd never agreed to any HOA authority. A lot of people wouldn't have those advantages, but I'd also been determined. When Rebecca tried to intimidate me in that first meeting, suggesting I'd lose if I fought, I'd known she was wrong. Property rights are fundamental. You can't just claim authority over someone's land because you filed some papers. In January, I got a letter from Paul Hutchins. He was the HOA board member who'd testified against Rebecca. The letter was short. "Mr. Eastwood, I want to apologize for my role in what happened to your property. I was wrong to go along with Rebecca's plans. I knew something wasn't right, but I convinced myself we were just being creative with HOA authority. I understand now that what we did was theft, and I'm sorry. I'm glad you fought back and that the truth came out. I hope you can enjoy your property in peace." I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it. It was a reminder that sometimes people do wrong things by convincing themselves they're justified. Rebecca had probably told herself she was just generating revenue for the HOA, helping the community, doing what needed to be done. The other board members had gone along because they trusted her or didn't want to make waves, but the impact on me would have been devastating if they'd succeeded. I would have lost my sanctuary, my investment, my weekend retreat, all because someone decided they had the right to make decisions about my property without my consent. February brought an unexpected development. A reporter from a property rights organization contacted me about doing a story on HOA fraud. She said cases like mine were becoming more common as HOAs tried to generate revenue and assert authority beyond their legitimate bounds. I agreed to talk with her, and the resulting article was published in March. It detailed my case along with several others around the country where HOAs had overstepped their authority or committed outright fraud. The article got a lot of attention and led to some states proposing legislation to increase oversight of HOA operations and protect property owners from fraudulent claims. In Georgia, a state representative introduced a bill requiring all HOA boundary claims to be verified by independent survey and requiring HOAs to maintain detailed records of property owner consent. The bill didn't pass that session, but it started a conversation. Through all of this, I kept living my life. I still worked my marketing job in Atlanta during the week and came up to the lake house on weekends. But now, every time I pulled into my driveway and saw that expanse of water stretching out beyond my deck, I felt a deeper appreciation for it. I'd fought for this place. I'd defended my rights. And I'd won. In April, exactly 1 year after I'd first seen that construction crew on my property, I threw a big party. I invited Marcus and his family, Detective Wilson, David Caldwell, and about 20 other friends from Atlanta and the local area. We grilled out, went fishing, and just enjoyed the property. Detective Wilson pulled me aside at one point during the afternoon. "You know, your case led to us investigating a bunch of other HOA complaints we'd received over the years. We found evidence of misconduct in 3 other associations. Nothing as blatant as what Rebecca did, but still violations of law. Your willingness to fight back and press charges made a real difference. I'm glad something good came out of it. More than you know. People are less afraid to challenge HOA authority now. They see that it's possible to fight back and win. That evening, as the sun set over Lake Sinclair and my guests mingled on the deck, I felt genuinely at peace. The whole ordeal had been stressful, expensive, and time-consuming, but it had been worth it. My property was mine, free and clear, with no bogus HOA claims hanging over it. David Caldwell came over as I was watching the sunset. "Beautiful place you've got here, James." "Thanks. Almost lost it." "But you didn't. That takes guts." "Just stubbornness, really," he laughed. "Sometimes that's the same thing." As spring turned into summer, life returned to normal. I stopped thinking about the case every day. The legal documents were filed away, the settlement money was in my account, and Rebecca Kensington was in prison. The whole thing started to feel like a strange nightmare that had finally ended. But I never forgot the lessons I'd learned. I checked my property records regularly. I monitored any legal notices in the county. I made sure my address was current with all relevant agencies so I'd receive any legitimate correspondence. And I kept all my documents organized and accessible just in case I ever needed to prove my ownership again. In August, I got a call from a man named Richard Thompson. He owned property about 5 miles down the lake from me. He'd read about my case and was facing a similar situation with a different HOA claiming authority over his land. "Mr. Eastwood, I don't know what to do. They're threatening to put a lien on my property for unpaid dues, but I never joined their HOA." I gave him Marcus's contact information and walked him through the steps I had taken, checking the deed, reviewing property records, documenting everything, and being prepared to fight if necessary. I also told him about the settlement I'd reached and how important it was to stand firm on property rights. "Don't let them intimidate you," I said. "If you didn't sign up for the HOA, they don't have authority over you. Get a lawyer and fight it." He thanked me profusely. A few months later, he called back to tell me he'd won his case without even going to trial. Once he presented his documentation showing he'd never joined the HOA, and once his lawyer mentioned my case and the criminal convictions that had resulted, the HOA backed down completely. That became a pattern over the next year. I'd get calls or emails from property owners facing HOA disputes, and I'd share my experience and advice. Some people hired Marcus, others found their own lawyers, but they all benefited from knowing that it was possible to fight back successfully. In December, I got a letter from the Georgia Department of Law. They were forming a property rights protection task force to investigate HOA fraud and abuse statewide. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to serve on an advisory committee. I agreed without hesitation. The committee met quarterly in Atlanta, and I was able to attend without much disruption to my work schedule. The group included lawyers, property rights advocates, representatives from legitimate HOAs, and several other property owners who'd faced situations similar to mine. Over the course of a year, we helped develop recommendations for HOA oversight legislation. The key provisions included mandatory registration of all HOAs with the state, requirements for clear documentation of property owner consent before HOA authority could be claimed, criminal penalties for fraudulent HOA actions, and easier pathways for property owners to challenge HOA claims. The legislation was introduced in January of the following year and passed in March with strong bipartisan support. The governor signed it in April, calling it an important protection for property owners across Georgia. I was at the signing ceremony. Afterward, the governor shook my hand and thanked me for speaking out about what had happened to my property. "Your case showed why this legislation was necessary," he said. "No one should face what you went through." "I agree, sir, and I'm glad other people won't have to." By the time the second anniversary of the construction crew's appearance on my property rolled around, my life had changed in ways I never expected. I was still working in marketing, still spending weekends at the lake house, but I was also involved in property rights advocacy. I spoke at several conferences about my experience, helped other property owners navigate disputes, and consulted with lawyers handling HOA fraud cases. The settlement money I'd received was invested wisely, generating enough passive income that I could afford to take more time off work to focus on advocacy. It wasn't something I'd planned, but it felt right. I'd been through something terrible, but I'd come out the other side with knowledge and experience that could help others. Rebecca Kensington was still in prison. I'd heard through Detective Wilson that she was up for parole consideration, but had been denied. The parole board noted that she'd shown no real remorse and had tried to minimize her actions as mere administrative errors rather than taking responsibility for the fraud she'd committed. Paul Hutchins and Sandra Meyer had completed their probation. I'd heard that both had moved away from the area, probably seeking fresh starts somewhere their names weren't associated with the scandal. David Caldwell and I stayed in touch. His construction company had recovered from the financial hit of the fraudulent building rights purchase, and he was doing well. We'd meet for lunch occasionally when I was in Atlanta, and he'd update me on his projects and ask about my advocacy work. "You know," he said at one lunch meeting, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad the whole thing happened." I raised an eyebrow. "Glad? You lost $300,000. "True, but it taught me to be more careful about due diligence, and it exposed a criminal operation that would have kept victimizing people. Sometimes you have to go through something hard to make things better." He had a point. That summer, I finally did something I'd been planning for years. I retired early from my marketing job. At 52, I had enough saved and invested that I could afford to live comfortably, especially with the settlement money and the lower cost of living full-time at the lake house. I spent my days fishing, maintaining the property, working on advocacy projects, and just enjoying the peace. No more commuting to Atlanta, no more office politics, just life on my own terms on my own land. Marcus and his family visited in July. We were sitting on the deck one evening, watching his kids fish off the dock, when he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just given up? If you'd seen that construction crew and decided it wasn't worth fighting?" I considered it. Sometimes. I think I'd have lost everything. The property, my peace of mind, my sense of security. Rebecca and her crew would still be out there scamming people. "You did a good thing, James. Not just for yourself, but for a lot of people." I just protected what was mine. That's exactly my point. You stood up for your rights when a lot of people would have been too intimidated or too tired to fight. That matters. His words stayed with me. I'd never thought of myself as particularly brave or special. I'd just been a guy who refused to let someone steal his property. But Marcus was right that it had rippled outward, affecting HOA practices, state legislation, and individual cases across Georgia and beyond. In September, I got an email from a woman in Florida who'd read about my case. She was facing a similar situation where an HOA was claiming authority over her beachfront property and trying to restrict her use of it. She'd hired a lawyer and was fighting back, but she wanted advice on staying strong through the process. I wrote back with a detailed response, sharing what I'd learned about gathering documentation, staying organized, not letting intimidation tactics work, and trusting the legal process when you're in the right. I also warned her that it would be stressful and potentially expensive, but that protecting property rights was worth it. She wrote back a few weeks later to say that the HOA had backed down after her lawyer sent them a detailed letter outlining the criminal penalties for fraud and referencing my case and the Georgia legislation that had resulted. They'd withdrawn all claims to her property without a fight. Stories like that made everything worthwhile. October brought a surprise. The Property Rights Foundation, a national advocacy organization, gave me an award for my role in fighting HOA fraud and supporting property rights legislation. The ceremony was in Washington, D.C., and they flew me out for it. I stood on stage in a hotel ballroom in front of 300 people and accepted a plaque recognizing my courage and persistence in defending property rights and exposing HOA fraud. In my brief acceptance speech, I thanked Marcus, Detective Wilson, David Caldwell, and everyone else who'd supported me through the case. But mostly, I talked about the importance of knowing your rights and being willing to defend them. "Nobody should be able to take your property through fraud or intimidation," I said, "and if they try, fight back. Document everything, hire good help, and don't give up. The law is on your side when you're protecting legitimate property rights." The audience gave me a standing ovation, which felt surreal. I'd gone from a guy who just wanted to fish at his lake house to someone receiving national recognition for property rights advocacy. Life takes strange turns sometimes. Back home in Georgia, I settled back into my routine. The fall weather was perfect, with cool mornings and warm afternoons. I spent a lot of time on the water, fishing for bass and crappie. The lake was mine to enjoy, free from any threat of development or HOA interference. In November, the 3-year anniversary of Rebecca Kensington's sentencing passed. She still had at least a year left on her sentence, maybe more depending on parole decisions. I didn't wish her any specific harm, but I was glad she was facing real consequences for what she'd done. Detective Wilson called me that month with some news. "James, thought you want to know. We just closed the books on the last of the HOA fraud cases that spun off from yours. Final conviction came through yesterday. Guy was running a scheme similar to Rebecca's up in Hall County." "Good. How many total cases came out of the original investigation?" 7 with convictions or guilty pleas, recovered over $2 million in fraudulent transactions, and the new state oversight has flagged another dozen HOAs for investigation. You really started something." "I just wanted to keep my property." He laughed. "Yeah, but you didn't stop there. You made sure other people would be protected too. That's the difference." December brought the holidays, and I hosted Christmas at the lake house for the first time. My sister and her family came down from Tennessee. Marcus and his family drove up from Atlanta, and a few other friends joined us. We had 20 people packed into the house, and it was chaotic and loud and perfect. On Christmas Eve, we all gathered on the deck despite the cold and watched the sun set over the lake. My nephew, who was studying law at Vanderbilt, asked me about the case. "Uncle James, do you think HOAs should be illegal?" "No, not at all. Legitimate HOAs serve a purpose. They maintain common areas, enforce reasonable standards, and can help preserve property values. The problem is when they overstep their authority or when corrupt people use them as tools for fraud. That's what needs to be prevented." "So it's about oversight and accountability?" "Exactly. HOAs should be accountable to their members and to the law, just like any other organization. When they're not, you get situations like mine." He nodded thoughtfully. "I might write my law review note on HOA governance and fraud. This is interesting stuff." I was happy to help educate the next generation of lawyers about property rights issues. Maybe they'd be the ones defending people in situations like mine down the road. As the new year arrived, I found myself reflecting on the entire journey. 3.5 years had passed since that April morning when I'd walked down to the water and found a construction crew on my land. So much had happened since then. The discovery of the fraud, the legal battles, the criminal trials, the settlement, the advocacy work, the legislation, the award, the retirement. My life had changed completely, but my property had remained constant. The lake still stretched out beyond my deck. The fish still bit in the early morning. The sunset still painted the water golden orange every evening. This place, this land, was still mine, free and clear. And that was what really mattered. Everything else had grown out of my determination to protect this 3-acre slice of waterfront Georgia. I'd fought because I refused to let someone steal what was mine. I'd continued fighting because I didn't want others to face the same threat. In February, I took a long fishing trip, spending 4 days on the lake with nothing but my boat, my gear, and my thoughts. The peace was absolute. No HOA threatening my rights, no court dates to worry about, no construction crews trespassing. Just me and the water. On the last day of the trip, I caught a massive largemouth bass, at least 7 pounds. I took a photo, released it back into the lake, and sat in my boat just absorbing the moment. This was why I'd fought so hard, for moments like this, for the freedom to enjoy my own property in peace. When I got back to the dock, I saw a car parked in my driveway. As I approached, Marcus got out. "Thought I'd find you out here," he said. "What brings you up?" "Good news. Remember that class action suit against HOA insurance companies for covering fraudulent activities? It's settling. You're going to get another check, probably around $50,000. I shook my head in amazement. "This thing just keeps paying." "Only because you were right from the beginning. The law is clear on property rights. You owned the land. You never signed with the HOA. They had no authority. Everything that's happened since then flows from that fundamental truth. We walked up to the house, and I made coffee while Marcus filled me in on the details of the settlement. It was gratifying to know that the insurance companies were being held accountable for enabling HOA fraud through lax oversight of the associations they covered. In March, I spoke at a conference for real estate attorneys in Savannah. The room was packed with lawyers interested in learning about HOA fraud cases and property rights litigation. I spent an hour walking through my case, the legal issues involved, and the broader implications for property law. During the Q&A session, a young lawyer asked, "What would you say to someone who's facing a similar situation but doesn't have the resources to hire an attorney?" It was a good question. First, document everything. Get copies of your deed, your property records, anything showing you never joined the HOA. Second, contact your state's legal aid services or look for property rights organizations that might help. Third, don't be afraid to go to the police if you believe fraud has occurred. And fourth, stand firm. Many of these situations are based on intimidation. When people fight back with documentation and determination, the fraudulent claims often collapse. After the conference, several attorneys approached me about consulting on cases they were handling. I agreed to help where I could, though I made clear I wasn't a lawyer myself, just someone with experience in this specific area. April arrived again, marking 4 full years since the construction crew incident. I spent the anniversary alone at the lake house, intentionally keeping the day quiet and reflective. I walked the property boundaries, checked the survey markers, and just appreciated what I had. In the afternoon, I sat on the deck with my old property files, the ones I'd compiled when first fighting the HOA claim. The deed was there, crisp and clear, showing James Eastwood as the owner of 3 acres at 4782 Lakeshore Drive. The original title insurance policy. The survey from when I'd bought the place, the tax records showing 15 years of payments. These documents had been my shield and weapon in the fight against Rebecca Kensington's fraud. They'd proven my ownership and my rights beyond any doubt. Without them, without keeping good records, the fight would have been much harder. I made a mental note to recommend to anyone buying property that they keep meticulous records. You never know when you'll need to prove your ownership and your rights. That evening, I got a call from Detective Wilson. "James, wanted to let you know, Rebecca Kensington's coming up for parole review again next month. Think she'll get it this time?" "Doubtful. She served 3 years of a 5-year sentence, and she's still maintaining she didn't do anything wrong. The board doesn't look favorably on that, but I figured you'd want to know in case you want to submit a statement." "I'll think about it." A week later, I wrote a letter to the parole board. I kept it factual, describing the impact Rebecca's fraud had on me and noting that her schemes had affected multiple property owners. I didn't express anger or demand she stay in prison, but I did emphasize that she'd shown no genuine remorse and that releasing her early would send the wrong message about property fraud. The parole board denied her release. She'd serve at least another year, possibly the full remaining 2 years, depending on her behavior and attitude. Summer brought more opportunities to enjoy the property. I had friends up almost every weekend for fishing, grilling, and just relaxing by the water. The house that had almost been stolen from me was now a gathering place for people I cared about, and that felt like the best possible outcome. In August, I got an email from a researcher at the University of Georgia's Law School. She was studying HOA fraud cases nationwide and wanted to interview me for her research. I agreed, and we spent 2 hours on a video call discussing every aspect of my case. "Your case is really the textbook example," she said. "Clear forgery, obvious fraud, criminal prosecution, civil recovery, and legislative reform all flowing from one incident. It's remarkable." I was just stubborn. "Maybe, but your stubbornness changed the law in Georgia and influenced reforms in several other states. That's significant." Her research was eventually published in a law review article that fall. Reading it was strange, seeing my own experience analyzed in academic legal terms, but it was also validating. What I'd gone through mattered not just to me, but to the broader understanding of property rights and HOA accountability. As the year wound down, I found myself more content than I'd been in years. The fight with the HOA, as stressful as it had been, had led me to a better place. I was retired and comfortable, living full-time at my dream property, doing advocacy work that helped people, and enjoying the peace I'd fought so hard to protect. Rebecca Kensington was still in prison. The Lakeside Estates HOA had been dissolved for years. The legislation we'd helped create was protecting property owners across Georgia. And I was here, on my deck, watching the sunset over Lake Sinclair, knowing that every inch of this land was truly and completely mine. On New Year's Eve, I raised a glass of bourbon to the lake as fireworks burst over the water from other properties around the shore. 4.5 years ago, I'd been threatened with losing everything. Now, I had more than I'd ever expected: security, peace, purpose, and the absolute certainty that my property rights were protected. The fight had been worth it. Every stressful moment, every legal bill, every hour spent gathering documentation and preparing for court. All of it had been worth it to protect what was mine and to help ensure others wouldn't face the same fraudulent schemes. As the new year began, I made a resolution to continue speaking out about property rights, to help anyone who reached out facing similar situations, and to never take for granted the security and freedom that comes with clear, unencumbered ownership of land. The house on Lake Sinclair would remain mine for as long as I lived. No HOA, no fraudulent claims, no construction crews showing up uninvited. Just me, the water, and the absolute certainty that I'd defended my rights and won. That certainty, that security, was worth everything I'd gone through to achieve it. And as I sat on my deck watching the first sunrise of the new year paint the lake in shades of pink and gold, I knew I'd do it all again if I had to. Property rights matter, standing up to fraud matters, and sometimes one person's refusal to be victimized can change things for everyone. My land, my rights, my home, protected, secure, and mine forever.